So I mentioned environmental supports, and these are pretty straightforward. So I'm not going to give you lots of examples of these. I'm going to show you just what's here on your screen right now. But these are essentially the kinds of visuals that let people know where to put things, where to find things, how to organize their environment. And so you see there's an example of clothing symbols that are put on a dresser drawer. So this could be used to help a child learning to get themselves dressed in the morning and find their own clothing items. It could also be a child who's learning to put away his own laundry. So if you want to stop having to put away everybody's laundry in the house, start teaching your child to put away his own laundry. It's a good life skill. And the images on the drawers can cue the person as to where things belong. On the left-hand side, you see a shot that was from my classroom when I was teaching at the School for the Deaf. And we regularly did cooking activities, and all of the symbols show whatever it is that's in the various cupboards and drawers and things like that. So I've just got Velcro on things. And I recognize that not everybody wants to put Velcro on their very nice home kitchen cupboards. I put them everywhere in the school, and my statement was always, it's for the children, so it doesn't matter. The janitor didn't always agree with me, but that's okay. But at home, you might not want to put sticky back Velcro on your cupboards because it will peel away your cupboards. In fact, I recall the janitor taking some Velcro off cupboards at school and little bits of wood coming off with it, which was why he didn't like me so much. But nevertheless, there are other ways you can do this. You can use sticky note glue stick. You can go to the office store, and in the sort of sticky notes section, there's a glue stick that makes Post-it notes, essentially. And that won't damage anything. It just essentially makes your symbols into Post-its. If you're putting symbols on your fridge to show what food is in there, you can print symbols out on magnetic paper. And so then that way they just magnet to your fridge. So there are lots of different ways that you could do that. But essentially, this is just about providing that information around where things belong, where can you get them, and where should you put them, okay? I do want to spend more time talking about visual schedules because they're a bit more complex, and there are a bunch of different ways that we might actually go about setting these up. So, as I've mentioned, visual schedules are really just a way of presenting information to people. We might use objects, so actual real three-dimensional things to represent activities. We might use photographs. We might use symbols. And if we're working with readers, we might also just use text, right? Just print only. Whatever we're going to use, it's got to be something that the child or the person understands, that makes sense to them. We're going to use these to give predictability, right? To provide some predictability and also to provide some structure. And again, think about how important structure is. For those of you who might be sitting at home because you're not going to work because of the pandemic and your structure is a bit off, what's happened in terms of your day-to-day life, right? So I know lots of us maybe aren't kind of getting up and putting on clothes first thing in the morning. We might be spending most of the day in our pajamas because, well, we're not going anywhere. What does it matter? Our sort of scheduled activities are kind of off because we're not going to work like we usually do. And so that structure is gone. And for lots of us, the more that we lose structure, the more that it impacts our lives in other ways too. So visual schedules can provide not only that predictability, but that structure. And I'm supporting a couple of individuals right now where they are spending most of their time at home during the pandemic. And we're using a visual schedule to sort of fill their day. They don't have a lot of things to do. They're kind of stuck at home. And so not only do they have some predictability with their schedule, but their schedule kind of structures their time. So when they're sort of sitting there going, I don't know what to do, they can go to their schedule and essentially we're scheduling in leisure activities for them because they're having difficulty sort of thinking of what should I do right now because I'm kind of stuck at home and wandering around. So visual schedules can be really helpful that way too for all of us. Visual schedules can support transitions between activities. So not only does it help you understand what you're doing right now, but it helps you sort of see, okay, well now it's time to stop this activity and move to the next activity. And then finally, we can use visual schedules to sort of take one task and break that task down into individual steps and show people what the individual steps are for a task. So let's say we're teaching someone to brush their teeth. We can actually break that down and have a small schedule that's just, here's how to brush your teeth, or a small schedule that's just, here's how to get dressed, right? The young man that I'm working with right now who's learning to dress himself independently, he also has a dressing schedule, and it's on his wall in his bedroom. And it's got all of the clothing items that he needs to put on in the correct order, because sometimes he forgets the correct order and he puts on something that shouldn't go on first, right? And so he's got a structure to help organize him. And he goes through, and as he puts on each item of clothing, he checks it off that it's done. And it's a way too of him being able to monitor where he's at, okay? Somebody's learning to make a sandwich for themselves, we can have a visual schedule for that that shows all of the steps. Okay, so let's look at some examples. First kind of schedule is the kind of one that you probably think of most often when you think about schedule, that sort of across the day, across multiple activities kind of schedule. And we call that a between activity schedule because it helps individuals move between activities. So this is the kind of schedule that shows somebody, from morning to night, what are you doing? First, second, third. We might include clocks in there to show what time activities occur, or we might just have a list of the activities, okay? So these are the kinds of schedules where we're providing lots of information to people so that they can see what's coming up. They can make predictions. It helps with transitions from one activity to the next. It can certainly reduce a lot of the stress and anxiety that comes when there's a lack of predictability. And again, just think to a time when, in the old days, you lost your paper planner, or your battery dies on your phone and you can't access your calendar, and you've got a meeting, but you don't have a plug-in and you're out somewhere and you can't remember where you're supposed to be, okay? So that kind of stress, we can help with that. It can increase independent and on-task behaviors. So if we teach individuals to follow a schedule and they learn how to move through a bunch of scheduled activities, they can be increasingly independent in a number of tasks because they know how to look at their schedule and do tasks one by one by one. And certainly this can help decrease disruptive or problem behaviors, especially when they're associated with things like a lack of predictability or abrupt transitions. So depending on the kind of representations you're using, if you're using objects or photographs or symbols of some sort, that might influence how you set up your schedule. So usually we'll be using some sort of object if we're working with individuals who have a significant visual impairment. So I've worked a lot with kids who are deafblind and used object-based schedules for them because they cannot see picture-based representations. They need to be able to feel it. I've also used object cue schedules with individuals who have quite significant intellectual impairments and maybe don't understand a two-dimensional representation. So although they can see it, it doesn't really hold meaning for them. So we use three-dimensional objects that hold more meaning. And so when you do this, it's certainly a bit more work in terms of coming up with symbols that are appropriate and sort of finding a place to keep all of those and organize them. And if you want more information, particularly on how to do this kind of a schedule, any organization that provides support either to blind children or deafblind individuals is helpful. So the Perkins Institute has some really nice resources. The Texas School for the Deaf and Blind also has some excellent resources. If you're here in British Columbia, the Provincial Outreach Program for Deafblindness, they've got resources. And I also talk about this more in depth in an ACT video that's online on visual support strategies. So it's a whole day presentation, and I talk about how to make the decision around this and some more information about how to choose objects. So we don't have time to go into all of that today, but if you're looking for more, you can access that video at Videos at ACT. So the way this works is that we'll have little boxes where we place objects in order. And so you move from the first box, you take the first object, and you do the activity that's associated with that. and then typically we've got some other kind of container, a different sized container that we use to represent things being finished. And so when you're done the first activity, you take the object and you put it in that finished box. And then you go and you get the second object and you do that activity, and so on and so forth, okay? If the individual is sighted, we can pair photographs or pair communication symbols with objects as a way of starting to teach them to understand what those things mean. But we want to make sure that we have a schedule system in place that has some sort of representation that is the most meaningful for the person. Because if we give them something that they don't understand, they might as well not have a schedule. Okay, so we want to make sure we provide something that holds as much meaning as possible. If you're using photographs, larger photographs, or you're using larger communication symbols like the ones that you see in the image here, you can just put them up on the wall. So in this picture, you see that there are hooks and all of the symbols are sort of put on hooks. You can use Velcro. Again, if you're in a home and you want to use your fridge as the place to keep your visual schedule, you can print out your symbols on magnets. And essentially, as activities are done, you can either turn them over if you're using hooks or take them off of the Velcro strip and put them in a box or an envelope to signify finished, okay? Another thing that you can do if you're using larger photographs or larger symbols and you want a portable schedule is to put all of those images in a small photograph book. So, you know, if you can go to the dollar store, the drugstore, wherever, and get those 4x6 photo albums where it's one photo per page, and they're usually $1 or $2. Those are really portable, so it's easy to carry your schedule around with you. Whereas if you're looking at a schedule like this where all your symbols are on a wall, you can't take the wall with you. So certainly a photo book is going to be more portable. But there is one problem with this, in that if you put a whole bunch of photos in the book, page by page, the child, the person using the schedule, can only see one photo at a time. And often we're working with individuals who have difficulty kind of holding and organizing a bunch of information in their head. And so they might see the one symbol, but then you turn the page, well, that's gone. I've forgotten about it. So a little trick here is to get an X-Acto knife and slice all of those pages out and use some clear packing tape to tape the pages together into an accordion fold. And then that way you can open everything out and you can see the whole sequence at once, okay? And again, as activities end, you just turn over the photo or turn over the symbol, okay? If you are using photos, a couple things to think about. It's certainly easier to get photos now. If you're talking about public places, you can go online and get photos. I come from the early days where I used to drive around the city with my 35mm film camera, taking pictures of things and then developing them, having them not turn out right, and drive back out and try it again. So it's way easier now. But you also just want to think about what you're capturing in a photo and what's going to hold the most meaning. So just a couple of hints around photos. Let's say that we want a photo to represent Starbucks, going to Starbucks. We could either have a picture of a Starbucks building, or we could have a picture of a drink that that person usually gets, or even just a Starbucks cup or a Starbucks logo. Really think about identifying the aspects that have the most information, right? Looking at that Starbucks, I mean, I know that Starbucks, but I know it's Starbucks because I'm really looking at some obscure cues. The green awning, there's a little bit of the word coffee that you can easily read that's not sort of cluttered up with the brick in the background, but it's not very clear, right? So the better picture is that actual cup or an individual Starbucks logo. Again, think about critical elements. So if I want something that represents reading a book, I could take a picture of a person sitting and reading. But if you look, there's a couch that's involved, there's a cup of tea. That cup of tea has a saucer. There might be a treat on that saucer. So there's all kinds of other information in that picture that could be misleading, whereas the book is a much more clear representation of what I'm trying to convey, okay? Back to some other ways of setting up visual schedules. If you're using smaller symbols, so these are symbols from the Boardmaker program, which I am thrilled to say Boardmaker 7 came out last week, and it is so much better than the online version that they've had for several years. So if you were an old days Boardmaker user and perhaps quit using Boardmaker when it went to Boardmaker Online because, like me, you didn't think it was very good, Boardmaker 7 is back and it is so much better. I beta tested it over the summer and then it opened up last week. So these are symbols from the Boardmaker software program, and if you Google Boardmaker, you'll be able to get information on how to purchase that. Thousands of symbols in there, and we're going to talk more about symbols if you're joining us tomorrow. I'm going to be talking about symbols tomorrow too. But these are 2-inch symbols, and they're placed in plastic pages that in the olden days were used to hold photographic slides when we had a slide carousel before we had fancy projectors. They're not as easy to get anymore, but you can get them on Amazon. I just got an order yesterday because I'm putting a schedule together for a client, and so I just got a whole stack of them. So you can still get them. You just might have to do a little bit of looking. But the nice thing with these is that they fit smaller symbols. You can sequence things along. They're 8.5 by 11 pages that are 3-hole punched, and they can go in a binder as well. So it makes them fairly portable. So I've supported kids in schools where they don't actually want all of the peers to know that they have a visual schedule. They put their schedule in a binder and they walk around carrying a binder like everybody else. I've also had individuals where they needed a portable schedule, and we've just taken these plastic sheets and folded them up, and we can stick them in a pocket or a fanny pack or whatever, right? So they're very portable. And as activities are finished, you pull the symbol out, turn it over, and put it back in. The only difficulty for some kids especially with slide pockets is that you've got to have pretty good fine motor skills to pull those symbols in and out. And so that's something to consider. Although one of the things that you can do is just cut a little V in the front pocket of the envelope. So there's your back of the envelope, your front of the envelope, the picture slides in. If you cut a little V in the front part, it makes it easier to grab the symbol to pull it in and out, okay? If you're using smaller symbols, slide pockets aren't a good option. Maybe the manual dexterity skills are just too much. You can slap some Velcro on a binder and just use the binder as your schedule. So in this photo is a student who has her schedule on the front cover of her binder. And so there's Velcro strips on the front cover, and that's where her schedule is built of what she's going to do. Inside the binder is sort of the holding place for all of the other symbols. And then as activities end, she'd rip a photo or a symbol off the cover and place it inside the binder. And so that's a way to get around that as well. And if you're looking for Velcro, I always recommend not to buy Velcro just at like the store in little packages because it's super expensive when you do it that way. In Canada, you can go to Velcro Canada. If you're in another country, look for your Velcro distributor, right? So look for Velcro distributors and buy great big rolls of Velcro because it's much cheaper if you do it that way. So I always have a couple of rolls of Velcro sitting in my office. Finally, another way to set up visual schedules is through the use of what's called the Portacom system. And this is the design of a mom whose children I taught. And she had 2 daughters. Both of them were profoundly deaf, and both of them had autism. And they started using visual schedules and were originally using those slide pockets. One of the things that they were finding difficult was the girls were starting to sign, and they'd be holding a schedule, and they needed 2 hands to sign. And so they'd put their schedule down and sign, and then they'd walk away and leave their schedule somewhere. And so she and I were talking one day about this issue, and we both kind of went, Velcro. And so she was a sewer. She went back and designed this, and it's something that you wear, the child wears around their waist, opens up, and your schedules, your symbols rather, Velcro inside. And all of your other visual supports can go in there as well. So these are available online for purchase. They run, usually, I'm trying to remember the exact price, but they're about $100. They're machine washable, so you can wash them. They last for a decent amount of time. I usually have children who use theirs daily for anywhere from 1 to 2 years before it starts to get a little raggy looking and they get a new one to freshen it up. So if you Google the Portacom system, you'll easily find this. Beyond daily schedules, what's going to happen today? We should also think about providing weekly and monthly information, and this is just a simple desk pad calendar that you can get from, Walmart, office stores, what have you. Great big calendars with paper symbols that you can cut and paste with a child to show them what's going to be happening. And especially right now during the pandemic, when our regular routines perhaps are a bit off, certainly at the time when schools were closed and kids weren't going to school, not knowing really what was going to happen from day to day, this is a good way of providing some information, right? If you've got your kids at home, you can use this as a way to show, when are we going to go for a hike? Or when are we going to go do this thing, right? So some of those things that, maybe you're doing with your child as a way to sort of, have some activities to do while we're not allowed to do a whole lot. This is a good way to provide that information, right? When kids are in school, you can use these calendars to show what are school days, what are weekends, when is it library day, when are swimming lessons, those kinds of things, okay? We can also embed a bunch of behavior supports within our visual schedules. So after dinner, you get ice cream, so we can show that first then within a schedule. We can provide choices within a schedule. So I can say, you need to make your bed, but after you make your bed, which activity do you want? Do you want to color or do you want to do Lego? And a child can choose what their next activity is. So that we're sort of giving them the option to choose the motivating activity and the rewarding activity that follows the work. In terms of skill development, so if you're thinking about, well, what's my child learning? Your child can learn a whole bunch of stuff while you're working with schedules. So you can expose them to a whole bunch of language and communication related skills, the vocabulary of all the activities that go into a schedule. You can work on things like turn taking. So I'm going to say what happens, and you find that symbol and put it in your schedule, and then I'm going to give you a choice and you can say what happens. Or negotiation. You want this activity, but we can't do it now. Let's see where in the schedule we could fit it. So you can do some of that negotiation. You can start using vocabulary related to time concepts, past, present, and future. So you can start teaching those kinds of things. You can use other time-related vocabulary like later and not yet and finished and soon. You can use timepieces. So you can use little clocks to show at this time, this activity, at the next time, the next activity. And you can also work on pre or early literacy skills. If you set your schedule up to work from left to right, top to bottom, that's an early reading skill because that's the direction in which we read. Having text on all of your photos or all of your symbols starts to expose your child to sight words. So some of those things can also be really important. In terms of schedules for individual activities, these are often called within activity schedules or mini schedules, and this is where we take one activity and break it down into its individual steps and create a visual that shows first this step, then the next step, and so on. So, right, given our current situation, here's a visual for how to wash your hands, right? And we've all seen a lot of these a lot more often lately. Just for some other examples, and you've got these in your handouts, I'm not going to talk through every single one, but I've got an example of a sort of task analysis or a visual schedule for getting dressed at a public pool, right? And all of the steps that need to happen. I was teaching a child, getting him ready to go to his first bowling birthday party, and he'd never been bowling before. And I made this visual that shows how many balls you get to bowl. And after he would do one ball, he would close the flap, and then he'd have two balls left. Close the flap after he does the second ball, and then after the third ball, and then you sit, because that's how bowling works. You get your 3 balls, and then you sit and wait. You can have other ones that look like this. It's a schedule for how to make a sandwich, right? It's essentially a recipe that we've put into picture format. And as you can see in this one, these aren't symbols from Boardmaker. These are just photographs. So I had somebody make a sandwich step by step, and I took pictures of all the steps. Okay? So these kinds of schedules can be really useful to teach people how to do a specific task and learn how to do that independently, okay? Now, some people make really good task analysis kinds of schedules and other people don't. You notice there's the IKEA image up there. I don't know if any of you have struggled your way through an IKEA visual before, right? But sometimes those aren't quite as clear as we would like them to be. So I always endeavor to make my visuals better than the IKEA ones. But essentially, when you're doing this kind of thing, you want to start with a task analysis. So you pick a task, like dressing, and then you break that task down into every single step in order. What do you do first? Underpants, then shirt, then socks. And then it's always a good idea to test that out to make sure you've included all the steps, because as adults, we go on autopilot a lot. We don't always really recognize all of the little steps that we're doing. So if you've made a task analysis and written those steps out, go through and actually follow the steps as you've written them and make sure that you've remembered everything, okay? Once you know you've remembered everything, then go ahead and create your visuals for each step. And then teach your child how to follow those, right? So start using those visual schedules.